Well, I finally got myself a Galaga, and this one's a doozy. According to the seller, it's got vertical collapse, cabinet collapse, and it doesn't make a sound when you coin it up. So more than likely I'm going to have monitor, PCB, and cabinet repair all in this one project. So we're in for a good time. And to make everything a little more exciting, it looks like somebody wired this thing with a cake mixer. So I'm going to go through and undo all of this, and I'm also going to go ahead and take care of all the basic maintenance before I start addressing the specific problems. When repairing an arcade machine, or anything similar to it, it's a good rule of thumb to start with the power. Power-related problems can manifest themselves in many ways, and you may think you have an issue with your PCB when in reality, your 5 volts is just too low. So I'm going to take care of everything power-related before I do anything else. Well, this may not be the most elegant spot to work in, but there's no way to disconnect these wires other than to cut them, so I'm going to have to do all my working right here. So this is the original power supply here, and as you can see the diodes are all toasted and somebody hacked in a wire. And normally I would try to fix something like this, but in this case I've got a power supply kit that plugs right into this connector here, so I can just swap that right in. And there we go. Got a brand new power supply that just plugs right in. Well, I've got another big problem here. This is not a G07 chassis, but this is a G07 tube. So I need to see what kind of chassis this is and make sure it's even compatible with this tube in the first place. So I did some research and I found out that this is a Sanwa PM1718 arcade monitor chassis. I don't know much about the history of it as to what game it would be in or what time it's from, but I do know one thing. It's rated for AC 100 volts, and I guarantee you that that cabinet is running on AC 120 volts. Now I know in Japan all their electronics run at 100 volts, and I know that a handful of Japanese arcade machines run on 100 volts but have a 120 to 100 volt step-down transformer inside the cabinet. I know these will also usually run on 120 volts, but I don't imagine that it's very good for them. Another thing is that none of the connectors on this match the G07. Even the video input, which is usually pretty standard on CGA games, is something unique. And someone has already repinned the yoke connector to connect to this chassis, so I can't just throw a G07 in the cabinet. So I've got my multimeter in resistance mode, and if I read across these wires here, I get about 2.5 ohms resistance, and if I read across these wires here, I get about 55 ohms resistance. And over here at my spare G07 tube, 56 ohms resistance, and 2.9 ohms resistance. So that's definitely a G07 tube in there, and this is definitely not a G07 chassis. Now I've got two options here. If the chassis is even compatible with this tube, I could repin all of the other connectors, swap the cabinet over from 120 volts to 100 volts, and then deal with whatever individual problems the chassis may have. Or I could redo this single connector and install another G07 chassis like the machine originally had. Not only do I have a stockpile of G07 parts, but it's also a much more common monitor that I'm far more familiar with working on, so I think this is the best decision. So I swapped that connector and I installed a rebuilt G07 monitor, so now I'm going to turn it on and see if it works or just starts a fire. So I can hear that the game board is running and the fluorescent light is running, but the monitor itself is not getting any power. And if I check with my multimeter, I'm getting 0 volts at the monitor, 0.04 volts. So something is interrupting the flow of power to the monitor. So I checked everything with my multimeter, and I found that the hot wire was running from this fuse straight to the fluorescent light and not to anything else. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I just realized after months of making videos like these that I have this light here that has an outlet on it. So not only would soldering have been a whole lot easier, but you also would be able to see a whole lot better too. So the image being backwards will have to do with the wiring I did earlier. I'll just swap 2 of those wires around and that should set the image straight. And I think the lack of red will have to do with the connector itself, because I was messing with that earlier. Well, I was right about having my wires crossed. Now I need to see if that video connector is the reason I don't have any red. Now if you look at this connector here, you can see that 3 of these pins are sticking out, and one of them is not. The one that is not is red. There was actually a pin broken off in here when I got the machine. I had removed it, but I didn't realize that it had pushed that back in. I removed this pin here using a really thin flathead screwdriver, and now I can just bend this back out and put it back in the connector. Well, you can just barely see it, but I've got red on the monitor now. So I'm going to adjust the picture so that all the colors come out nice and bright. Now that is just gorgeous. Oh, what happened? Something died. What happened? I think we have blown a fuse. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that if the center of your fuse has a ring of smoke in it, that the fuse is probably blown. I'm also going to go out on a limb and suggest that it was probably a faulty fluorescent light fixture and not the switching power supply that caused this. As per the usual, I'm going to replace the fluorescent fixture which blew that fuse with a LED fixture. I hate these stupid fuse packs from Lowe's. I just need a fuse of one specific rating. Now I'm going to take off this tinted window here and clean it, because it's really blurring the image. Yeah, that'll blur your image a little bit. Well, just like the guy said, I can't coin the game up, even though I've taken it back off of free play mode. Although, I bet that right there is going to be our culprit. Yep. Well, I saw a spark earlier, and now the monitor is completely dead. And no, I didn't miswire it again this time. We are back at the bench proper, and the first thing I did was remove this fuse from about the middle of the board. And if I check it with my multimeter here, I'm getting a ton of resistance, which means the fuse is blown. But thankfully, I have some spares on standby because I've been down this road before. Oh my goodness.
It was just a fuse!
As you can see, the bottom of the cabinet has started to cave in up at the front where the leg levelers are. So I'm going to cut out a 2x4 and hopefully strengthen this area so that this will be sturdy enough for some wheels. Oh gosh, it's got wheels. Well, I fiddled with trying to just attach 2x4s to this particle board floorboard, but this floorboard is just too weak to support anything. The wood screws go straight through it without getting any grip. So I'm going to build a whole new bottom out of plywood and secure that to both the bottom and the sides of the cabinet, and hopefully that will give it enough structural integrity to roll around on wheels. So here is what I did. I cut out a big sheet of plywood for the bottom and bracketed that to the sides as well, and I used sheetrock screws which grip the particle board a lot better, and a ton of wood glue. I've let this sit for a while and now it's strong enough that I think I can go ahead and pop some wheels on it and see how it holds up. I initially tried unscrewing the existing leg levelers, but the screws were flatheads and they were very small and very rusty. And since the particle board was not offering any structural integrity at this point, I just removed them with the back of a hammer. Then I installed my new wheels. I would have liked to have installed these closer to the edge of the cabinet, but I'm working with what I've got here. Apparently this board has been serviced on the 19th of December 1994 by Mr. Ray, and he has determined that the board is good. Well, he sure did a darn good job, because 28 years later the board's still working. We are back over here at the bench, and even though this Galaga board is working fine, I'm going to remove all of these chips because the legs are known to corrode really badly. So I'm going to remove them all and sand them down with this silverware sanding sponge, and that should remove all the corrosion and prevent any problems in the future. And here is an example of one chip that I have cleaned the legs on, and there is one with heavily corroded legs. Well, what I feared would happen has happened. When these legs get corroded, they get very, very weak, and one of the legs on this chip has broken off. So now I'm going to have to take a socket and connect that tiny nub of a leg to that socket. That way the whole chip can still be removed without destroying the new leg. Even though the board doesn't technically need to be recapped, there's a really cheap cap kit on Arcade Shop, and these are going to go bad one day anyways, so you might as well go for it. Oh, I've got a RAM error. Well, let me just see what I did wrong this time. I wonder if that has something to do with it. The last thing I need to address is a sound issue. On most of the sounds in music, you can hear a bassy thump in the background that's not supposed to be there. If I look at this amplifier here, I can see the legs on it are pretty corroded too, and the component itself is pretty hot to the touch. So I'm going to replace that and see if it fixes my problem. Well, there we have it. We took the Galaga from flat line to front line, and this is definitely one I'm going to be playing a lot over the years. One last note, this is something interesting I like to do with all my machines. I write down what the coin counter read when I first got the machine, that way I know how many times I've played it since I bought it. If you made it all the way to the end, thanks for watching, and I've got 5 or so more videos in the works right now, so hopefully those will come out eventually.